So let me begin by saying what lethal autonomous weapons are, or killer robots as they're known in the media. So according to the United Nations, these are weapons that can locate, select, and eliminate human targets without human intervention. And it's often said that this is science fiction. Perhaps it's something that will happen in the future, but at the moment these weapons don't exist. In fact, that is the British government's official position. But they do exist, and some of them have already been banned. So landmines fulfill these criteria in a degenerate way. So they can only locate and select if the target happens to be near enough for them to detect it, because they don't move. And it's their inability to distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate targets that has led to them being banned. But we also have the Samsung Sentry robot, which is currently deployed at the edge of the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. And this robot can see people up to 4 kilometers away and kill them. Israel has produced a missile called the Harp, which can be given a mission to explore any defined geographical region and find any target satisfying certain criteria, which may be visual criteria such as looks like a bus, or has a radar signature similar to that of an anti-aircraft battery, for example. And then when it finds such a target, it will dive bomb it and destroy it. So these weapons have been of concern. They've also been something that has been funding a great deal of research in artificial intelligence since the 1960s. Particularly in the US, the Defense Department has seen the possibility of using AI to create intelligent weapons as one of the main technological advantages that the US could possess in future. And until recently, I would say the AI community has been completely asleep at the wheel, paying really no attention to whether this is a good or a bad idea, and just seeing it as something cool that we could do with AI. So that's changed recently. So in 2014, the first informal discussions began at CCW. So CCW is the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, which is a treaty that includes protocols that we normally think of as the Geneva Conventions. And so these embody international humanitarian law, which I'll get into more detail later. And the concern was that possibly these weapons could be in violation of international humanitarian law, and therefore there needed to be discussions about their status. In 2015, the AI community got its act together, and an open letter was created and signed by more than 3,000 active researchers in AI, and more than 20,000 other concerned scientists signed on to that as well. And that letter actually produced more than 2,000 newspaper articles in over 50 countries. It also produced an editorial in the Financial Times of really surprisingly definite condemnation of autonomous weapons as a future technology. So the next step after informal discussions at CCW is called the Group of Government Experts. So this is where the member states can send delegations of officially appointed experts to discuss definitions and technical considerations and begin drafting the various elements that would become part of a treaty. They also think about verification regime, they think about sanctions, and so on. So that was a big step forward until late 2016. The US in particular had been opposing the formation of a GGE, and I think it was really the Obama administration coming to understand the risk that these weapons pose that allowed this important step to happen. And this year, it's really been quite busy. So by now, we have 26 nations that are explicitly supporting a total ban on lethal autonomous weapons. So in Europe, Belgium and Austria are unequivocal in their opposition to the weapons. France and Germany are proposing something called a political declaration, which is much weaker than a treaty, but it's a sort of a moral commitment to keep lethal weapons under what they call meaningful human control. China, I think, was probably the biggest prize so far in terms of their announcement that they would support a treaty banning these weapons, and also the non-aligned movement, which I think has 77 nations as members, declared their opposition. In September, the EU Parliament voted 566 to 47 in favour of a ban, and directed the EU Commission and the national governments of the EU to negotiate a treaty. The EU Parliament doesn't have any statutory power in this area, so this is really sort of an advisory vote. And then 2 weeks ago, the United Nations Secretary General gave his strongest speech so far to push the member nations of the UN towards having a treaty. And the political situation right now is that of the 88 active member states in CCW, by far the majority are in favor of either a treaty or a political declaration with a moratorium attached. But the CCW operates by consensus. So any nation can sort of simply raise a point of order saying that discussions need to be adjourned. And in other treaty areas, for example, the fissile material cutoff treaty, some nations have been doing that every week for the last 20 years. So every week, everyone gathers in Geneva, they sit down, someone raises a point of order saying, adjourn, and they go away and they come back the following week. So you need to have consensus to make things work at the CCW, which is quite different from the General Assembly. And at the moment, Australia, Israel, Russia, the US, and South Korea are in the CCW discussions opposing a move from a GGE phase to the formal treaty negotiations. And as we'll see, the UK has also stated their opposition to moving towards a treaty. And part of the problem is that there's complete confusion, at least apparently complete confusion, about what people are talking about. So the definition I gave you earlier seems perfectly straightforward. It's autonomous if it can locate, select, and attack targets without human intervention. And we can show examples of weapons that can do that. But here's Germany's most recent official statement. So it's autonomous if it has the ability to learn, which really has nothing to do with autonomy, and to develop self-awareness, which is completely meaningless from a technical point of view. So nobody in computer science has any idea how to develop a self-aware machine or to detect that a machine has self-awareness. So this is rather like saying, it's only a missile if it moves faster than the speed of light, right? So this is really an embarrassment to the German scientific establishment and military establishment. But here's the UK position, which says that it has to be capable of understanding higher level intent and direction, which I think is deliberately vague as to what that really means. Capable of deciding a course of action from a number of alternatives, without depending on human oversight and control. And such systems that the UK claims are not yet in existence and are not likely to be for many years, if at all. So, as an AI researcher, I can say that this is both nonsense and false at the same time. Nonsense and false at the same time. So, for example, the prototype self-driving cars meet all these criteria. You can give high-level direction, like take me to the airport. It can choose how to get there, where to stop for fuel if it needs to, what route to take. It can change its route in mid-journey, and so on. So clearly, capabilities are there already. And in fact, I would say developing a practical self-driving car is much, much more difficult than developing a practical autonomous weapon. partly because the tolerances for self-driving cars are so tiny. We can only afford a 0.0000001% failure rate, right, in order to be about 10 times more reliable than a human driver. Whereas I was talking to the chairman of BAE Systems and suggested that a 40% failure rate would be perfectly acceptable for an autonomous weapon, and he agreed with that notion. So from a technical point of view, this is quite feasible. So all we really mean by autonomy, and I think part of the problem is that the word autonomy, when we apply it to humans, comes with a whole collection of philosophical associations and complications about free will and self-determination and so on, and it's really nothing to do with that. So, for example, a chess program is autonomous in the sense that we require. Okay, so the human says win, that's high-level direction, and the chess program sees the current situation on the board, which is not something that the human has ever anticipated. Almost all chess positions in actual games are things that haven't been seen before. And then it calculates a course of action based on the situation that it perceives. So it's the fact that its decision-making is dependent not on just the human's ability to decide, but on its perception subsequent to the beginning of the mission about how it's going to carry out the mission. And a chess program decides which enemy pieces to kill. It decides where to move its own pieces and so on. So it's basically doing everything that that the UN requires an autonomous weapon to do. So let me talk a little bit then about the legal issues. And the initial concern, as I said, in the UN was whether autonomous weapons could actually comply with IHL at all. So IHL says that an attack is not, they're not laws about weapons, they're laws about attacks. So an attack has to be carried out in such a way that discriminates between combatants and non-combatants. And this is, so if you attack by laying a minefield, in most cases you're not complying with IHL because mines can and often do kill civilians and children and so on. It also has to be militarily necessary. So you can't, for example, attack people who are surrendering or running away because then you're simply killing people rather than achieving a military objective. And there has to be proportionality. The proportionality means that, yes, we are allowed to have collateral damage, but it has to be proportionate to the value of the military objective. So, if there's one enemy soldier hiding out in the middle of a city, you can't drop a nuclear weapon just to kill that soldier while killing 500,000 other people. That's not proportionate. So, when I first read about this, in fact, because I'm a member of Human Rights Watch, I got an email from Steve Goose, who's the Arms Control Director, saying that they were creating a new campaign to bring about a ban on autonomous weapons because of the possibility of violating IHL. My first reaction was actually almost the opposite, that HRW has been saying for since its beginning that the real problem is these terrible humans on the battlefield or on the quasi-battlefield, these soldiers or paramilitaries killing civilians for the joy of it or whatever it is they do, and violating human rights left and right. And now HRW is saying, oh, these robots are terrible, compared to human soldiers who are wonderful, and we have to ban these robots. So my initial reaction was, I'm not quite sure I buy HRW's argument here that robots are going to be far worse than human soldiers in terms of violating human rights. And I would say, at least on the first consideration, discrimination, I think it's an engineering question, and it's obviously a moving target in the sense that AI is getting better and better, and quite probably we could build systems that in most situations would be more effective at discriminating than your average human soldier, who is subject to all kinds of stresses and confusions and so on that robots don't deal with. I would say necessity and proportionality are more difficult, and in many cases probably not feasible right now for AI systems, because that really requires a contextual understanding of what's going on in the battlefield and in the war at large. So, so what this means is that for an attack with autonomous weapon systems to be legal, it would have to be limited in scope, so that essentially the person who's initiating the attack and specifying the scope of the mission, like specifying what is the geographical region that the weapons are going to search over to find targets, what is the criterion for targeting. So when the human is specifying that mission, they're the ones who are going to have to judge necessity and proportionality. And so that means that they can't give very open-ended missions over a wide geographical region where there could be all kinds of civilians and as well as combatants. And but the scope of the mission that's going to be legally allowable is going to increase as AI capabilities increase. Okay, and so this makes it quite difficult to say at any given point what is legal and what's illegal in the deployment of autonomous weapon systems. There's another part of IHL which is also important, and this has led, for example, to Japan's opposition to autonomous weapons. The way they described it, that we will never deploy machines that are capable of murder. So it's really a moral objection that it's fundamentally wrong to turn over decisions about life and death to machines. And so the Martins Clause says anything that violates the principles of humanity and the dictates of public conscience could be taken as a violation of international law. And this is a very squishy clause, and as far as I know, it's never been successfully applied to any weapon system. But there are some proposals from, for example, the chairman of BAE Systems. His objection, and he declared that his company would never make these autonomous weapons. His objection was really that these are fundamentally wrong from a moral point of view. And I proposed actually that AAAI, which is the Association for the Advancement of AI, that's the main professional association for AI researchers, should have at least one policy platform. At the moment we have no policy platforms. We should have at least one, that we shouldn't write software that can decide to kill a human being. Right? Just one line, very simple, as a principle that the scientific community should stand by. So, it's not clear yet. I think if you ask most people, what do you think about autonomous weapons, they either haven't heard of them, or they might think, oh yeah, that sounds great, then I wouldn't have to send my son off to do national service. So we can send robots instead. If you ask the question the other way around, like, would you like to be attacked by robots or by humans, they usually say, oh, definitely no robots attacking us, that would be terrible. So I think human nature is a bit fickle on this point, depending on which end of the barrel of the gun you're looking down, so to speak. But if you think about what happened with that photograph of the little Syrian boy who drowned, his body washed up on the beach, and in fact Peter Buketz from HRW was the one who tweeted that photograph to the world. That had an enormous impact. I mean, it had direct political effect on the refugee policy in Germany and other countries. You can only imagine what would happen if we actually had video of robots hunting down and killing children in some city. And that would be very likely to happen if these weapons were deployed. So those are the human rights considerations. And when you talk to a lot of the diplomats in Geneva and how they're thinking about this problem, they're thinking about it as, okay, well, we know that the Americans have these remotely piloted drones, which are piloted by humans, so they're not autonomous. But what if we took that human out and replaced the human with a robot? So now this drone is then being operated autonomously and has its own onboard target selection and attack decision making. And I actually want to argue that this is a really almost a red herring, because once we have autonomous weapons, they're simply not going to be used in the same way that we currently use drones and other remotely piloted things. Like, there are remotely piloted tanks, remotely piloted submarines, and surface ships, and so on. But the important thing about autonomy is precisely the decoupling of the human from the weapon. And I think we're much more likely not to see autonomous weapons looking like this, which is about 25 feet long. I think these cost about $50 million each. And they have about a dozen people running each one. So there's a primary pilot, but there are people who look after fuel, navigation, attitude, all kinds of health maintenance in flight, and so on. So they're actually quite personnel intensive. But I think we're going to see weapons look much more like this. Right? This is a standard off-the-shelf toy quadcopter. The wholesale price of these would be between $1 and $2. They can fly faster than a human can run, and they have a range of 1 to 5 miles, depending on exactly how big they are and exactly what the battery technology is. And here's one that we actually made in. This is a CGI. This is not a real object. It's computer generated, but it turns out that the Swiss Defense Department has actually made one of these just to check that it really works. I don't think the Swiss are planning to deploy these kinds of weapons. And it contains a small explosive charge, about 3 grams of explosive, that makes an EFP, an explosively formed penetrator. And this is enough to kill a human being. And the Swiss experiments show that even if you're wearing a helmet, it can still blow a hole into your head and destroy your brain. So, and perhaps this it's a bit more robust than the toy, but probably on a mass scale, this would be about $10. So, just for comparison, is an interesting statistic I learned. I learned a lot of very gruesome stuff actually in doing this work. In World War II, somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000 bullets were fired for every casualty. So 1,000 bullets cost $330 at present prices. So forget about the guns, forget about the cost of the soldiers or the airplanes or whatever it might be. Just the lead and the explosive charge to make the bullets is far more expensive if you're trying to kill people with guns than if you're killing people with these things. Okay, so think of these as extremely cheap bullets that almost always will find a target and kill it. So this is the real consequence of autonomy. Right? It's not that it protects your soldiers from harm. It's not that the weapons are unemotional and unaffected by fear or hatred. It's that autonomy decouples the number of people that you need to launch an attack from the number of weapons that you can launch. So in that sense, they're weapons of mass destruction. One standard container can hold about 1 million of those devices, and that's enough to wipe out a large city. And if you compare that, well, people would say, well, with 1 million automatic rifles, I can wipe out a large city. Yes, that's true, but you need 1 million soldiers to carry those rifles. You need 5 million support staff or maybe even 10 million if you're American, to feed and transport and train and house and fix those 1 million soldiers. And so you can only do that kind of thing with Kalashnikovs if you're on the scale of a nation state. And we have a whole international system that's designed to keep things of that scale from happening, because when nation states do them, it's very, very obvious. It's a large-scale mobilization. It's a huge military-industrial effort to launch attacks of that scale with human soldiers. But with weapons, you know, a million of those might be $10–20 million for the container, and you need a couple of guys to specify what the objective is, and you need some way to get the container, some sort of transportation to get it near enough to the target. And so they're really a sort of scalable weapon of mass destruction. So in fact, they're much better than nuclear weapons for achieving military objectives. They don't leave radioactive smoking rubble behind. They just eliminate whichever people you feel you need to eliminate in order to then have political control or military control over the territory that you want to capture. So that's one argument. I think there are other arguments that various groups, including HRW, have raised. And these arguments are applicable not just to these sort of scalable weapons of mass destruction, but to other kinds of autonomous weapons, such as submarines or fighter aircraft, where we're not going to be deploying them by the tens of millions, but they're still extremely effective. So one thing is that I think they create an extremely unstable strategic situation, because when you change the software, you can go from strategic inferiority to strategic superiority simply with a software update. If your algorithms become better than your enemy's algorithms at dogfighting or underwater detection of submarines and so on, then you gain strategic superiority in a single update. And so it's very hard for countries to know where they stand in terms of their strategic situation. You also don't even know if you have an army or navy anymore. Right? You may have 20,000 unmanned combat aircraft, but you don't know if they work for you, because their software could have been compromised at any stage in manufacturing or post-deployment. And it might be that if you activate them, the first thing they're going to do is start attacking your own population, which wouldn't make you very popular. So these things tend to create unstable strategic situations, because no one really knows where they stand relative to the enemy. And people also talk, and this is actually something that the US military is very concerned about what a military flash crash, meaning that the algorithms of the opposing autonomous defense systems somehow mistake the actions of the other side as aggressive, and then initiate a response which very quickly escalates out of control, because there are no humans in the loop. Things could reach the point of a real war before human beings could even understand what's going on. And once you have autonomous weapons, you don't have a choice about whether to have a human in the loop. If you put a human in the loop, you've already lost, because you're going to be destroyed before the human has time to react. There are other issues. So when you deploy weapons, one of the things the weapons need to do to defeat their adversaries is actually to adapt in real time. So they don't follow fixed algorithms. They actually try to learn how their opponents behave and then modify their own behavior in order to overcome whatever tactics they perceive from the other side. And this can lead to things spiraling in very unpredictable ways in terms of how the weapons end up behaving. So there's a very good report by the Center for New American Security. Paul Shari is actually one of the authors of the current US military doctrine on autonomous weapons, and he goes through all these examples in great detail. So since I'm here, I want to come back to the UK position on this. So this is the government's official position as stated in Parliament, that the government will make sure that our weapons will always be under human control. That's very reassuring. But this is also a public statement made by Her Majesty's government. We continue to oppose a legal instrument or ban that would prejudice legitimate technological advances. And so I had a meeting at the Cabinet Office day before yesterday with some of the national security people, and I pointed out that these two statements seem somewhat contradictory, because basically we're saying we are committing military suicide. We guarantee that we will never have autonomous weapons, but we want all other countries in the world, including our enemies, to have them. Which just doesn't make any sense. So I put this contradiction to the national security people, and they said, oh, yeah, okay, I'll get back to you on that. So, I can't really explain it. And I was hoping to get some wise explanation and to come away a much wiser person, but I didn't.
They're all a bit distracted.
I think that has something to do with it, yeah. So to summarize, and we have the prospect that if we move ahead with autonomous weapons, we're creating another category of weapon of mass destruction that's much cheaper, much easier to proliferate, and potentially much more dangerous than any existing class of weapon of mass destruction, and they're bad enough as it is. And I think from a technical point of view, we can define this reasonably well. We can have verification mechanisms. So as with the Chemical Weapons Treaty, we can have cooperation of all of the manufacturers of precursor elements like quadcopters and computer vision algorithms, tracking algorithms, and so on. So we can, I think, have a reasonably effective verification regime. But I would say that at the moment the political situation is very confused. I think many of the nations don't really understand what they're talking about, or they're deliberately obfuscating. Russia is another good example. Russia says, well, these weapons are something that science fiction has said, maybe but 20, 30, 40 years in the future. At the same time, they're actually selling them. So the Kalashnikov Corporation is selling an autonomous ground vehicle with machine guns attached. So there you go. Okay, I'll end there. I'm happy to take questions.